3 days after the billionaire CEO kicked his pregnant wife out of their mansion to marry his mistress, she stood in a borrowed dress at the charity gala he was hosting with his new woman. His sister threw a wine glass at her, calling her a gold digger in front of Manhattan's elite, unaware the woman she was humiliating had just inherited a $50 billion fortune from her estranged father that morning. The CEO, David Hamilton, watched the scene unfold with amusement rather than shame, the same cold expression he'd worn when he'd had security escort his wife of 7 years out of their home while she pleaded for their unborn child. But Elena Martinez wasn't crying anymore. She was calculating, her father's lawyer having revealed not just the inheritance, but the shocking truth about who actually owned 47% of her husband's company through shell corporations her father had established. The revenge she took didn't require violence or screaming, just a single phone call to the board of directors that would bankrupt him instantly. How did a woman dismissed as worthless suddenly become the most dangerous person in the room? What secret did her estranged father's fortune hold that gave her complete control over her husband's empire? And when David Hamilton realized the pregnant wife he'd thrown away was now the one woman who could destroy everything he'd built, would his mistress still want him? Elena Martinez had never imagined her marriage would end with security guards gripping her arms while rain pounded against the mansion's windows. David Hamilton stood in the marble foyer with his phone pressed to his ear, discussing stock options with someone in Tokyo, while his wife of 7 years begged him to reconsider. The guards, men she'd hired herself 2 years ago for their family's protection, wouldn't meet her eyes as they pulled her toward the door. But David's gaze was steady, cold, completely devoid of the warmth she'd once believed defined him. "Please, David, I'm pregnant," Elena whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach, where their child, barely 8 weeks along, was growing. She hadn't planned to tell him this way, had wanted to create a special moment with candles and his favorite meal, yet desperation had ripped the secret from her throat. David's jaw tightened as he ended his call, his 6'3" frame blocking the staircase that led to the bedroom where they'd made love just 3 months ago, back when she'd still believed his late nights were about building their future rather than building a relationship with someone else. "That's convenient timing," David said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he used with incompetent employees during board meetings. His gray eyes, the ones that had captivated her at a college fundraiser 10 years ago, swept over her rumpled jeans and oversized sweater with something approaching disgust. "You've been useless for months, Elena. No social connections, no business value, and now you're trying to trap me with a pregnancy claim?" The words landed like physical blows, on each one dismantling 7 years of memories Elena had treasured. She remembered meeting him when he was just starting Hamilton Technologies, how she'd helped him prepare for his first investor pitch, had skipped her own graduate classes to proofread his business proposals. Her family's initial $200,000 investment, money from her mother's life insurance after the car accident, had given David the seed capital to build his empire. Yet he spoke to her now as if she were a stranger, begging for spare change. "I have the test results," Elena said, reaching into her purse with trembling fingers. But David raised his hand to silence her. "Vanessa is already pregnant with my child," he announced, and the revelation sucked the oxygen from Elena's lungs. Vanessa Chen, the 26-year-old marketing director who joined Hamilton Technologies 18 months ago, was apparently not just David's mistress, but the future mother of his heir. "She's 3 months along, and unlike you, she actually contributes to my company. We're getting married as soon as the divorce is finalized." The guards pulled harder now, dragging Elena toward the door while she processed the timeline of David's betrayal. 3 months meant he'd gotten Vanessa pregnant while still making love to Elena, still kissing her goodbye each morning, still signing anniversary cards with promises of forever. The rain grew louder as they opened the door, cold wind whipping through the foyer and scattering the rose petals Elena had arranged that morning before discovering David's affair. "You can't just throw me out," Elena managed, her voice breaking as thunder cracked overhead. "This is my home too. My name is on the deed." David's laugh was sharp and cruel, echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the mansion Elena had decorated with such care. "Actually, I had my lawyers check. Your name was removed from all property documents 6 months ago when we restructured the company assets. You signed the papers yourself, remember? You were so trusting, so eager to help with whatever I needed. The memory surfaced like a drowning victim. David bringing home stacks of documents, telling her they were routine tax forms, watching as she signed page after page without reading the fine print because she'd loved him, trusted him, believed in their partnership. Elena's knees weakened as she understood the depth of his planning. David had been orchestrating her removal for months, carefully erasing her legal ties to everything they'd built together. My lawyer will contact you about the divorce terms, David continued, already turning away as if she were a problem solved rather than a person destroyed. Don't try to come back here, Elena. I've already changed all the security codes. The guards deposited her on the front steps, and the door closed with a finality that echoed through Elena's chest. Rain soaked through her clothes within seconds, but she stood frozen, staring at the mansion where she'd dreamed of raising children and growing old beside the man she'd loved. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a number she didn't recognize. Yet Elena let it ring, too shattered to face whatever additional disaster awaited. What she didn't know that the call was from her estranged father's estate lawyer, didn't know that the man who'd abandoned her at birth had just died, leaving her a $50 billion fortune. All Elena knew in that moment was that she was homeless, pregnant, and completely alone. Elena spent the first night in a budget motel near the airport, the kind of place where the neon sign flickered and the bedspread smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, despite the no-smoking policy. She'd withdrawn $300 from the ATM before David could freeze their joint account. Money that would maybe last a week if she was careful. Yet the financial panic was nothing compared to the emotional devastation that kept her awake until dawn. Her phone had buzzed 17 times with calls from the unknown number, but Elena had ignored each one, assuming it was David's lawyers already circling, like vultures ready to pick apart what little she had left. The morning brought nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy, and a sick feeling that intensified when Elena checked her bank account and discovered David had indeed frozen everything. 7 years of her life, and she'd been erased as efficiently as deleting a computer file. She was staring at the $247 balance on her screen when someone knocked on the motel room door with an urgency that suggested official business rather than housekeeping. Elena Martinez? The man in the hallway wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's car, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. He carried a leather briefcase embossed with the logo of Whitmore & Associates, one of the most prestigious estate law firms in the country. I'm Richard Whitmore. I've been trying to reach you about your father's estate. Elena's father, Miguel Santiago, was a name she rarely spoke and never thought about without a complicated mix of anger and abandonment. He'd left when Elena was 2 days old, telling her mother he wasn't ready for fatherhood, and had disappeared so completely that Elena had sometimes wondered if he'd died years ago. Her mother had raised her alone, working double shifts as a nurse, until the car accident that killed her when Elena was 19, leaving Elena with just enough life insurance money to finish college and help David start his company. My father has been dead to me for 33 years, Elena said, starting to close the door. But Richard's next words stopped her cold. Miguel Santiago died 3 days ago in Monte Carlo. And he left you everything, Richard explained, his tone carrying the weight of information that would reshape reality. His estate is valued at approximately $50 billion, including real estate holdings across 7 countries, a controlling interest in Santiago Global Industries, and various investment portfolios. But there's more you need to know about how your father has been involved in your life, Ms. Martinez. The room tilted as Elena processed the number. $50 billion was more money than she could conceptualize, more than David's entire company was worth, despite his constant boasting about breaking the billion-dollar valuation. She stumbled backward, sitting heavily on the motel bed while Richard entered and carefully closed the door behind him, his expression suggesting he delivered world-altering news regularly, yet never grew immune to the shock it caused. That's impossible, Elena whispered, her mind racing through memories of poverty, of her mother's struggles, of begging David for grocery money in recent months while he claimed cash flow problems. If my father was a billionaire, why did he abandon us? Why did my mother die exhausted and broke? Richard opened his briefcase and extracted a folder thick with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be surveillance reports spanning decades. Your father didn't abandon you out of cruelty, Ms. Martinez. He was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder shortly after you were born, the same condition that eventually killed him. And he didn't want you to watch him deteriorate. He left to protect you from that trauma, but he never stopped watching over you. The photographs Richard spread across the motel bed told a story Elena had never known existed. Her elementary school graduation, her father standing in the back row of the auditorium, her college acceptance letter, a scholarship she'd thought was merit-based but was actually funded by her father's foundation, her wedding to David, Miguel in a dark suit at the very back of the church, crying as he watched his daughter marry a man he apparently already distrusted. Your father had investigators tracking David Hamilton from the moment you started dating, Richard continued, pulling out more documents that made Elena's hands shake. He discovered David's pattern of using people for financial gain and discarding them, his history of minor frauds in college, his tendency toward narcissistic behavior. Miguel wanted to warn you, but his lawyers advised that you'd never believe a father who'd been absent your entire life. Elena stared at a surveillance photo of David kissing Vanessa Chen outside a hotel 6 months ago, long before Elena had suspected anything wrong. Her father had known about the affair, had documented it, had apparently been preparing for this exact moment when David's betrayal would leave Elena vulnerable and destroyed. So instead of warning me, he just watched me suffer? Elena asked, anger rising through the shock and grief. The nausea returned, stronger now, reminding her of the pregnancy that complicated everything. She was going to be a single mother just like her own mother had been, yet with resources her mother could never have imagined. Richard's expression softened as he pulled out the final document, a letter in her father's handwriting, written just weeks before his death. He did more than watch, Ms. Martinez. He protected you in ways you're only beginning to discover. 7 years ago, when you gave David $200,000 from your mother's life insurance to start his company, your father matched that investment secretly through shell corporations. Over the years, he's been systematically purchasing shares of Hamilton Technologies through various entities, always staying below the disclosure threshold that would alert David to the accumulation. The implications crashed over Elena like a tidal wave, her grief and shock transforming into something sharper, more focused. How much do I own? 47%, Richard said. His smile suggested he'd been waiting to deliver this particular piece of information. David Hamilton thinks he controls his company with his 51% stake, but he's been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of his own capital structure. You, Ms. Martinez, are now the second largest shareholder of Hamilton Technologies. Combined with the minority shareholders who have been complaining about David's management decisions, you have enough votes to remove him as CEO, dissolve the company, or bankrupt him entirely. Elena picked up her father's letter with trembling hands, her eyes scanning words that would have changed everything if she'd received them sooner. He wrote about watching her from a distance, about the agony of staying away even when he wanted to embrace her, warned about building a fortune specifically to ensure she'd never be vulnerable the way her mother had been. The letter ended with a prediction that proved Miguel Santiago had understood his daughter's husband better than Elena had understood him herself. If you're reading this, David has finally shown his true nature, the letter concluded. Don't mourn the marriage, my darling girl. Mourn only the time wasted on someone unworthy of you. The tools for your revenge are in your hands now. Use them wisely and know that your father loved you every single day of his life, even from a distance. Elena's tears fell onto the paper, smudging ink that represented a love she'd never known she had. Yet the tears weren't just from grief anymore. They were from rage, from betrayal, from the crystal clear understanding that David Hamilton had thrown away the one woman who could have stood beside him forever, and in doing so, he'd handed her the weapons to destroy everything he'd built. The motel room suddenly felt less like a place of desperation and more like a war room where Elena would plan her next move. There's a charity gala tomorrow night, Richard said quietly, watching Elena's expression transform from broken wife to something far more dangerous. David is hosting it with his mistress as a public debut of their relationship. Your father's will stipulates that you must attend. He wanted you to face David from a position of power, rather than hiding in shame. Elena looked up from the letter, her dark eyes no longer filled with tears but with a cold calculation that would have made her father proud. Then I'll need a dress. The charity gala at the Grand Celestial Hotel was the kind of event that defined Manhattan's social hierarchy, where champagne flowed like water and a single table cost more than most people earned in a year. Elena arrived in a midnight blue Valentino gown that Richard's team had acquired that afternoon, not the designer original she would have worn as David's wife, but a borrowed piece from a boutique whose owner owed Richard's firm a favor. The difference between her current circumstances and her former life should have humiliated her. Yet Elena walked through the gold-adorned entrance with her head high, one hand clutching a small evening bag that contained the documents that would end David's world. The ballroom was a sea of Manhattan's wealthiest, and their jewelry catching the light from crystal chandeliers that cost more than Elena's childhood home. She spotted David immediately at the center of the room, his arm wrapped possessively around Vanessa Chen, who wore a white dress that seemed deliberately bridal in its innocence. Vanessa's hand rested on her barely visible baby bump. 3 months along, David had said, and the tender way David touched her stomach was a gesture Elena had never received during her own pregnancy announcement. The contrast burned through Elena's chest, reminding her that some betrayals couldn't be measured in dollars, but in the dreams they murdered. David saw Elena approximately 30 seconds after she entered, his confident smile faltering as confusion crossed his features. He'd clearly expected his discarded wife to be hiding in shame somewhere, not attending the gala where he was publicly claiming his new life. Elena watched him whisper something to Vanessa, whose pretty face twisted with an ugliness that suggested she viewed Elena as a threat rather than a defeated opponent. Elena made her way to the champagne fountain, accepting a glass of sparkling water instead, since pregnancy had eliminated alcohol from her options. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was carrying David's child while he celebrated his mistress's pregnancy, both women existing in his life like characters in a play he'd written, without considering their humanity. She was scanning the room for members of Hamilton Technology's board of directors when a sharp voice cut through the ambient conversation. "What are you doing here?" Christine Hamilton, David's younger sister, appeared at Elena's elbow with the kind of aggressive energy that had always made family gatherings uncomfortable. Christine had never liked Elena, had always implied that her brother had married beneath himself, despite Elena's master's degree and the family money that had launched David's company. "David said you'd finally left. You're not welcome anymore." Elena turned slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Christine wore a red dress that matched her lipstick and her disposition, her blonde hair swept up in a style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Behind Christine stood several other members of David's inner circle, his college friends who'd benefited from his success. High with the executives who'd climbed the corporate ladder by flattering his ego, the social climbers who'd befriended his wife only to abandon her the moment she was no longer useful. "It's a charity event," Elena said quietly, keeping her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "I bought a ticket." The lie came easily. Richard had actually arranged her invitation through one of his connections. Yet Elena knew the truth didn't matter to people like Christine, who viewed the world as territories to be defended against intruders. Christine's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her champagne glass raised in a way that seemed more threatening than celebratory. "You're such a gold digger," Christine hissed, her voice rising enough that nearby conversations began to pause. "You trapped my brother with your sob story about your dead mother, took his money, and now you're here trying to ruin his happiness with Vanessa. Everyone knows you've been worthless for years." The crowd was forming now, a circle of Manhattan's elite drawn to drama like moths to flame. Elena could see David pushing through the gathering crowd, but he wasn't rushing to defend her. He was smiling, actually smiling, as if his sister's cruelty was entertaining rather than horrifying. Vanessa clung to his arm, whispering something that made David laugh, and Elena understood with perfect clarity that this humiliation had been planned, that they'd wanted her to attend specifically so they could destroy her publicly. "My brother is finally with someone worthy of him," Christine continued, her voice projected for maximum audience impact. "Someone young and beautiful and actually useful. You're just a desperate woman trying to cling to a life you never deserved." Elena felt the moment approaching like a storm on the horizon, the inevitable confrontation that her father had somehow predicted when he'd insisted she attend this event. She thought about the documents in her evening bag, about the 47% ownership stake that nobody in this room knew existed, about the revenge that would be so much sweeter because they'd all witnessed her supposed degradation. "Christine, that's enough," a weak voice called from the crowd, someone Elena vaguely recognized from the company's accounting department. Yet the protest died quickly when David shot the speaker a warning glare. "It's not enough," Christine said, raising her champagne glass higher. "Sure, she needs to understand that she's nothing now. She's nobody. She's—" The champagne flew through the air in a perfect arc, the golden liquid catching the chandelier light before splashing across Elena's borrowed Valentino gown. The wineglass followed, hurled with enough force that it shattered against Elena's shoulder before falling to the marble floor in a spectacular explosion of crystal. The liquid was cold against Elena's skin, soaking through the expensive fabric and dripping onto the floor while the crowd gasped with a mixture of horror and excitement. "Gold digger!" Christine spat, her face flushed with wine and righteousness. "That's all you'll ever be." The ballroom fell completely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on Elena as she stood there dripping with champagne and humiliation. David was laughing now, actually laughing, while Vanessa pressed her face against his chest as if overcome with emotion. The executives, the socialites, the board members Elena had been searching for were all watching, judging, witnessing what they believed was the final degradation of a woman who'd fallen from grace. Elena reached up slowly, wiping champagne from her face with fingers that didn't shake, despite the rage coursing through her veins. She touched her baby bump instinctively, protectively, and felt something inside her shift from grief to absolute clarity. Her father had known this would happen, had known David would orchestrate her public destruction, and had given her the tools to respond in a way that would be equally public, but infinitely more devastating. "I need to make a phone call," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying in the silence with an authority that made several people shift uncomfortably. She pulled her phone from her evening bag, the documents she needed already photographed and ready to send. "It'll only take a moment." Christine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Calling your lawyer? Good luck finding one who'll work for free, because David made sure you're broke." Elena smiled then, an expression that didn't reach her eyes but conveyed something that made the nearest observers step backward. "I'm not calling my lawyer, Christine. I'm calling the board of directors of Hamilton Technologies. You see, I just inherited something from my father. The father David always mocked for abandoning me, and it turns out he left me more than just money." David's laughter stopped abruptly, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion to the first hints of fear. "Elena, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the 47% stake in your company that my father accumulated over 7 years," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The shell corporations you never traced back to their source. The voting shares that, combined with the minority shareholders who've been complaining about your management for months, give me control of Hamilton Technologies. The revenge I'm taking won't require throwing drinks, Christine. It just requires exercising my rights as the second largest shareholder." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Elena's phone dialing the first board member on her list. The phone call took exactly 4 minutes, yet those 4 minutes contained the complete destruction of David Hamilton's empire. Elena stood in the center of the ballroom with champagne still dripping from her gown, her voice steady and professional as she spoke to board member after board member, each conversation witnessed by hundreds of Manhattan's elite who'd come for charity and stayed for carnage. David's face progressed through disbelief, rage, and finally a pale terror that Elena had never seen in 7 years of marriage, the look of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "James, this is Elena Martinez, formerly Elena Hamilton," she said into her phone, addressing James Porter, the board's longest-serving independent director who'd clashed with David repeatedly over the company's aggressive expansion strategy. "I'm calling to inform you that I've just assumed control of my late father's shareholding in Hamilton Technologies, a 47% stake accumulated through Santiago Global Industries' various investment vehicles. I'm formally requesting an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to vote on David Hamilton's removal as CEO, citing gross mismanagement of company assets and inappropriate personal conduct that creates liability exposure. She could hear James's sharp intake of breath through the phone, his response carrying across the silent ballroom as Elena had deliberately set the volume high enough for everyone to hear. Elena, I've been waiting 3 years for someone to challenge David's stranglehold on this company. His decision to funnel company resources into his personal real estate projects has cost shareholders millions. If you have the voting power you claim, you'll have my full support. David lunged forward then, his hand reaching for Elena's phone. Yet Richard Whitmore materialized from the crowd like a guardian angel in an expensive suit, his presence alone enough to stop David's approach. Behind David, Vanessa's face had gone completely white as she apparently began calculating whether the CEO of a bankrupt company was still worth the scandal of being his mistress, her hand dropping from her baby bump as if the pregnancy was suddenly less valuable than she'd believed. You can't do this, David said, his voice cracking with desperation that Elena had never heard before. That company is mine. I built it from nothing. You built it from my mother's life insurance money? Elena corrected. Placing her second call to Margaret Chen, no relation to Vanessa, the board member who specialized in corporate governance and had been documenting David's violations of fiduciary duty for months. You built it with my father's secret investment. You built it while lying about who owned what and whom you were sleeping with. But you didn't build it alone, David, and that was always your fundamental mistake. The second call was even more damaging than the first, as Margaret had apparently been compiling evidence of David's self-dealing for the past year, waiting for someone with sufficient voting power to challenge his control. She confirmed that 3 other board members had already contacted her that evening. News traveled fast among the directors, and that they had more than enough votes to remove David immediately, to dissolve his employment contract and potentially pursue criminal charges for the company funds he'd diverted to personal use. Christine had collapsed into a nearby chair, her earlier bravado completely evaporated as she watched her brother's empire disintegrate. The wine glass she'd thrown lay shattered at Elena's feet, the crystal fragments catching the light like the pieces of David's broken future. Several guests were filming now, their phones capturing the moment when Manhattan's rising tech star fell from grace in the most public way possible. The videos already uploading to social media where they'd be viewed millions of times before morning. The shareholders will sue you, David threatened, grasping at any weapon he could find. You'll destroy the company value. Everyone will lose money. Elena ended her second call and looked at her husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, with an expression that contained no pity, no regret, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally served. The shareholders will thank me for removing a CEO who was systematically looting their company. Stock price might drop temporarily during the transition, but without you draining resources for your personal mansion, your mistress's shopping sprees, and your sister's luxury lifestyle, Hamilton Technologies will actually become profitable. I've already secured commitments from Santiago Global Industries to inject capital and from 3 industry veterans to serve as interim management. The final piece of information broke something fundamental in David's composure, on his knees buckling slightly as he grasped the full scope of Elena's preparation. This wasn't a revenge born from impulse or emotion. This was a calculated corporate takeover, executed by a woman he'd dismissed as worthless, guided by a father he'd mocked as absent, and funded by a fortune he'd never known existed. The pregnant wife he'd kicked out of their mansion 3 days ago had spent those days not crying, but strategizing, not begging, but building alliances, not accepting defeat, but preparing for total victory. You're vindictive, Vanessa said suddenly, her voice shrill with panic as she apparently realized David was about to be both broke and notorious. You're destroying him because you're jealous. Elena turned to the mistress slowly, her hand moving to her own baby bump in a gesture that made Vanessa flinch. Oh, I'm not destroying him out of jealousy. I'm destroying him because he threw his pregnant wife into the rain, because he stole from his shareholders, because he abused every person who trusted him. The fact that it bankrupted him instantly is simply the natural consequence of his choices. The words bankrupt him instantly rippled through the crowd like electricity, the phrase that would dominate headlines tomorrow as financial journalists dissected the fastest corporate collapse in recent Manhattan history. David Hamilton, the billionaire CEO who'd appeared on magazine covers and financial news programs, would become a cautionary tale about hubris and betrayal, his fall documented by hundreds of witnesses who'd watched karma arrive in a champagne-stained Valentino gown. Richard stepped forward then, handing Elena a tablet that displayed the preliminary vote tallies from board members he'd been texting throughout her phone calls. 11 votes for removal, 2 abstentions, 1 opposed, he reported quietly. David's gone, effective immediately. The board wants you to serve as interim chair until permanent leadership is established. Elena stared at the numbers, processing the speed of her victory. 72 hours ago, she'd been homeless and heartbroken, yet her father's love had reached across death to ensure she'd never be powerless again. The $50 billion inheritance would secure her child's future. But this moment, watching David Hamilton realize he'd destroyed himself by underestimating the woman who'd loved him. This was the real gift her father had given her. "I'll accept the interim chair position," Elena said, in her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "My first act will be a complete audit of all company expenditures from the past 3 years, with particular attention to personal expenses charged to corporate accounts. My second act will be reviewing all employment contracts for nepotism and inappropriate relationships. My third act will be ensuring that Hamilton Technologies becomes a company that values loyalty, integrity, and the people who built it, rather than the narcissists who exploited it." David's face had gone gray, his hand gripping Vanessa's arm so tightly she winced. "You'll regret this, Elena. I'll fight you in court for years." "With what money?" Elena asked simply. "Your salary is terminated. Your company's shares will be tied up in litigation. And the prenuptial agreement you had me sign specifically excludes you from any inheritance I receive. You're about to discover what it feels like to be powerless, David. Consider it a learning experience." She turned away from him then, walking through the crowd that parted like a sea before her. The champagne stains on her dress transformed from symbols of humiliation to badges of triumph. Behind her, she could hear Vanessa's voice rising in panic, asking David what would happen to them now, asking if he'd lied about his wealth, asking if she'd destroyed her reputation for a man who was suddenly worth nothing. Christine remained slumped in her chair, the woman who'd thrown the wine glass now, understanding that her cruelty had triggered the exact revenge her brother deserved. The charity gala continued around them, but the real story was already spreading beyond the ballroom. Texts, calls, social media posts documenting the night Elena Martinez inherited a fortune and used it to bankrupt the billionaire CEO who'd thrown her away. Richard walked beside Elena as they exited the hotel, the cool night air a relief after the stifling ballroom. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "He always said you had his strength underneath all that kindness." Elena looked up at the Manhattan skyline, the city lights blurring slightly through tears that were no longer from grief but from relief, from vindication, from the overwhelming knowledge that she'd survived the worst betrayal and emerged stronger. Her hand rested on her baby bump. The child who would grow up knowing her mother had refused to accept defeat, had fought back with intelligence rather than violence, had proven that underestimating women was the most expensive mistake powerful men could make. "Tell the board I want the company renamed," Elena said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Not Hamilton Technologies, Santiago Martinez Industries, a tribute to both my parents, the one who left me money and the one who taught me resilience." Richard smiled, already typing notes into his phone. "Consider it done." As Richard's car pulled away from the hotel, Elena looked back one final time at the glittering building where her old life had finally completely ended. Tomorrow would bring legal battles and corporate restructuring, media attention and public scrutiny. Yet tonight she'd proven something her father had always known, that the pregnant wife they'd kicked out of the mansion was never the victim of their story, but the architect of their downfall. David Hamilton had thrown away the one woman who could have stood beside him forever, and in doing so, he'd handed her the keys to his kingdom. The revenge she'd taken didn't require violence or cruelty, just the simple exercise of power he'd never known she possessed. And as Manhattan disappeared behind her, Elena whispered a thank you to the father she'd never known, but who'd loved her enough to ensure she'd never be powerless again.